So I'm going to talk to you a little bit about the crisis that people have been talking about as they have tried to make the case for why we need so much natural gas here in New England. And one thing that has crept into my mind over and over again as I have worked on this issue and as I've worked in the energy field for the last 7 years is that story that you probably heard when you were a little kid. It's called The Emperor's New Clothes. And that's a story about this wonderful new cloth and new clothes that this tailor was going to make for the emperor. But only people who were especially smart and especially good and especially valued could actually see the fabric. And because no one was willing to point out that there was nothing there, everyone was convinced, and the emperor had a huge parade where he walked down the street naked. That's my Texas accent coming out. And only a little boy in the crowd was willing to point out and say, there are no clothes. What you have done, what everyone in this room has done, is played the role of that little boy. And when people try to tell you that the energy system is too complex for you to understand as a layperson, what you need to say back to them is that maybe it's too complex for them to explain. But you have a right, as the people who live in this area and as the people whose lives are affected by this, to have that energy system explained to you in a way that's understandable and to have a role in determining what that energy system looks like going forward. So I'm going to start out by giving you a little bit of background on how we got where we are and what the system currently looks like here in New England. And then I'm going to talk to you about where we are now and about all the pipelines that are currently pending for our region. So let's see if I can figure this out. I'm not the best with technology. So this is a chart that shows you what's been happening and what's projected to happen in terms of our natural gas use in New England. If you look down at the blue portion of the chart, that's the amount of natural gas that has been used for residential, commercial, and industrial heating and for transmitting the heating. So you can see that blue level is pretty close to 0.4, 0.5 trillion cubic feet. Now, if you look at the part that's above, the red and white lines, it looks innocuously like candy canes, that is the amount of natural gas that has been used to generate electricity in New England. And we start back in 1998, and if you look there, that was down at maybe 0.2, a little bit less than 0.2 trillion cubic feet of natural gas was going to electricity generation in New England. And as you go through, you see that we've started to increase the use of natural gas for electricity generation, and that it's projected to really ramp up and has started to ramp up as early as 2008 and 2009 to be the primary source of electricity in New England. Now that dramatic increase in the use of gas for electric generation is happening here in New England, but it is happening all across the country. And it is that increase in natural gas, as opposed to an effort to diversify our mix of energy generation, that is causing a lot of the clamoring for new natural gas pipelines that we're seeing. Here's how that increase in natural gas for electric generation came about. What I'm showing you now is the figures for the coal plant capacity factors from 2005 until 2011. Here in New England, we have a fairly old energy generation fleet of power plants. So all of the names of power plants that are listed right there on that chart are power plants that were built from the 1940s to the 1970s. And power plants are supposed to last between 30 to 40 years. That's their expected useful lifespan. And the reason for that is because after 30 to 40 years, technology has improved. Efficiency levels for power plants should have improved. And our knowledge of the pollution from power plants improves. And we learn that there are better ways and more efficient ways to generate power. In New England, what we did in the late 90s was we restructured the electricity market. And that meant that we wanted to be able to expose owners of power plants like these to the economic risks that were associated with the pollution that they were emitting. So before 1997, if I owned a coal-fired power plant and I needed to put on new expensive pollution controls to control mercury from my emissions, I could go to the Department of Public Utilities and say, well, this public health thing is really causing me trouble and I'm gonna have to install these expensive controls. Because they're for the good of the public, I want the public to pay for those controls. And so the ratepayers who were in that service territory were forced to pay to put the pollution controls on those power plants. And so one of the things that groups like Conservation Law Foundation and many others came together to do was to say that's not the right way for this to work. Those coal plant owners need to be exposed to the costs of creating cleaner electricity. And so they've had to be exposed to the market forces finally. And what happened as a result of that is that over time, as more and more stringent environmental regulations came into place, as we generated more capacity for our markets from energy efficiency, and as cheap natural gas started to come online, coal-fired power plants and oil-fired power plants could no longer compete. So you can see that's a dramatic drop-off in the amount of energy that was being generated from those plants. And we've now seen breaking point, 3 of those units, 4 of them will be retired, 3 of them were coal. Merrimack in New Hampshire, we've got a Clean Air Act litigation going against them right now. Mount Tom is going to be shutting down, and Salem Harbor Station is going to be shutting down, or has already shut down as of June of 2014. So as those plants went offline, we had system operators like ISO New England, and we had regulated entities, and we had regulators who, instead of thinking of this as an opportunity to create a new grid for our region that meets the climate and environmental goals that we've set out for ourselves, panicked. And they said, we just want to replace this with more of what we know. And natural gas is great because it reduces the really bad pollutants like sulfur dioxide. As you can see, this is a chart that they're very proud of, they like to show. On the right, the far right corner there, you see the levels of sulfur dioxide from our regional electric grid, and they've gone down dramatically, and that's great. But when you look at the curve for how much carbon dioxide emissions have gone down, and this, by the way, doesn't account for fugitive emissions, so for any of the emissions that are lost along the way. But if you look at the curve for that, that's not nearly a dramatic enough curve in reductions of CO2 to get us to where we need to be to meet our climate goals. And because the powers that be are used to having a certain type of system, one that's built around really big fossil fuel-fired power plants that are then connected